Flights out of Kabul canceled amidst chaos at the airport. Thousands trying to flee the Afghan capital following the Taliban takeover. Frenzied diplomatic evacuations also underway, with governments scrambling to respond to the crisis. Coming up, a special on the collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban's return to power, with live reporting and analysis here on France 24. Hello and welcome to this France 24 special on the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. We begin with the chaos at Kabul's airport. Thousands of people have been crowding the terminal and rushing the tarmac, hoping to flee the Afghan capital after its fall to the Taliban. A chaotic situation that prompted the U.S. military to fire shots into the air in a bid to control the crowd. The United Arab Emirates has said it is working on plans to facilitate evacuations of diplomatic staff through its airport, and our reporter, Catherine Norris-Trent, is in Dubai. Catherine, what's the latest on the hasty diplomatic evacuations taking place?
Yeah, diplomatic missions from around the Western world have been scrambling to get their citizens and those who've been working with them out of Afghanistan. So we know the French embassy has relocated, as have several other countries' embassies, such as the UK. They've relocated inside Afghanistan's Kabul's international airport there in order to be able to get their staff out very quickly once they've completed their evacuation work. So they're processing visas from the airport. Now, at the moment, only military flights are operating. So they're chartering these military flights, all the countries lining up to be able to use the runway on the military side of the airport. We know France has already started evacuating its citizens. They're aiming to get around 250 people out, and they're trying to reach out to other people who may be vulnerable to try and get them out. But of course, it's extremely chaotic down there at the airport. They will be shuttling back and forth between Abu Dhabi airport, where France has a military base, and that process has already started. We've already seen, of course, Britain starting its evacuation process, the United States really using its helicopters to transfer people to and from the embassy building, what was its embassy building, now to the international airport, trying to get people in a safe position. Germany, Italy as well, Australia, we've seen them all rushing to get people associated with their diplomatic missions and some charities out of the country.
And as we've seen in the program, it's not just foreign diplomats that are trying to get out of Afghanistan. Thousands are civilians are as well. What's the latest on the civilian rush to flee the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really chaotic and distressing scenes coming from Kabul International Airport. The videos that have been broadcast, circulating on social media, many of them verified, of people running onto the tarmac, clinging on to US military planes as they're taking off from Kabul. Of course, extremely dangerous, and other pictures seeming to show then people falling to their deaths. Very distressing pictures indeed, and just shows the level of desperation and panic which is circulating among some of the people there. And these videos showing large crowds of hundreds, if not thousands of people there trying to board planes at the international airport. Reports the US military has fired warning shots in the air to try and clear people off. There's other pictures showing helicopters, US helicopters appearing to clear the path of military planes taking off from the runway there. So, I mean, desperate and very dangerous scenes indeed, and really showing the waves of panic at this stage in Kabul.
Indeed, and several airlines have said they are no longer flying over Kabul airspace. You yourself were affected by that, weren't you? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's right. At the moment, it is only military planes that are being able to take off, and those with quite some difficulty as well. All civilian and charter planes are not taking off or landing in Kabul at the moment. There's one runway which is usually shared between military aircraft and civilian aircraft, and that is only being used, requisitioned by the US military and other countries' military at the moment. I myself was in one of the last flights destined to land in Kabul yesterday, and we got as far as over the city of Kabul, but we had to circle several times around there before we were told by the pilot that that airport had been blocked off by a plane which had been parked horizontally across the runway. They said a technical problem, but it seems, that was a sign that that airport had been officially closed off. It's been confirmed, no civilian flights at all taking off or landing in Kabul at the moment. And we can only imagine that will be the case for perhaps another few days while these military evacuations run their course.
All right, thank you for that update. Catherine Norris-Trent reporting for us there. Now, with the Afghan government now collapsed, the Taliban say they're looking to provide for the population.
In the past, we didn't have as much responsibility as we do today, because now we're all being tested by God. Every day we will get involved to serve our nation and to provide the people with security and hope for their future.
And we can now bring in France 24's terrorism expert, Wasim Nasser. Now, Wasim, thanks for joining us. The main reason the U.S. invaded Afghanistan back in 2001 was to make sure the country couldn't be used as a launch pad for terrorist operations against the U.S. and to diminish al-Qaeda. Were those goals achieved?
Well, actually, al-Qaeda wasn't diminished, but it was prevented from conducting or operating attacks against the United States from Afghanistan, similar to the attacks of the 11th of September. But actually, in reality, even the attacks of September 11 were mostly prepared in Europe and the United States, and not really on Afghan soil, if you want to go into operational details. But today, the fact is that al-Qaeda is stronger than in 2001. But on the other hand, I guess that Afghanistan wasn't used over the 20 past years to conduct operations against the American interests. And the deal that was cut with the Taliban in Doha was that they will prevent this from happening. So it is in the interest today of the Taliban to prevent al-Qaeda from operating attacks from Afghan soil. It doesn't mean that al-Qaeda won't develop inside Afghanistan. It would most probably be the case, since they even participated in the latest offensive of the Taliban. And regarding the family ties and the tribal ties that they have today with the Taliban, either in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. But the new factor today in Afghanistan is the Islamic State. And the Islamic State is being fought by the Taliban, which arranges the United States too, because the Islamic State is a danger for Taliban, because they have a very huge potential in Afghanistan actually, but up to now they have been contained by the Islamic State. And on the other hand, the Russians also don't want the Islamic State in the former Soviet republics. So if the Taliban can handle this issue for them, it will also be acceptable by the Russians. And I remind you that the Taliban even went to Peking and they met the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They were received as an official delegation a few weeks ago in China, and of course they talked about the Islamic Party of Turkestan regarding the Uyghur issue. So to sum it up, if the Taliban prevent al-Qaeda from preparing attacks in the West, and they keep fighting the Islamic State to prevent it from developing in this region of the world, I guess that they can sustain their power, and by giving those guarantees to foreign powers and to regional powers.
All right, Wasim Nasser, thank you for that analysis, France 24's terrorism expert. Now we're going to cross to Bilal Sarwari for the latest on the ground in Kabul. Now, Bilal, one day on from the Taliban seizing the capital, how have they been establishing their rule there?
The Taliban have been going home to home, collecting weapons and armored vehicles and other properties that they said it belongs to the government, to the public. They have been collecting that from former MPs and other officials. Instead, they are handing them a letter that guarantees that has happened. At the same time, the Taliban have been able to go to the police chief's headquarters in the city of Kabul, and they said that they have now got radio communications with various parts of the city of Kabul. So their priority for now is to make sure that there's law and order. They say that they will not allow looting and chaos. On the other hand of Kabul city, inside the Hamid Karzai International Airport, we are seeing very chaotic, tragic, scenes of thousands of Afghans literally, playing with their lives, including women and children, trying to get onto planes, because outside of the airport, the Taliban are there. They fear for their lives. These are mostly people who either served as translators with Western militaries or people who served in the government. And the fact that it has come to this, that people are getting killed inside the airport, that people are wounded, more than 50 of them, only shows you the chaos that is left after 20 years of massive international and American investment in blood and treasure. And at a time when the Americans and others are running away, literally trying to evacuate their citizens and certain Afghans who work with them, this sort of scene is terrorizing the world, not only Afghans.
And that really speaks to the fear that a lot of residents are feeling, I imagine, following the Taliban takeover. What are people that you've been speaking to expressing in terms of that fear?
Well, people are very worried and they have fears what the Taliban will do, although the Taliban's, public position has been very clear and constant. They have instructed their fighters not to get inside people's home. They have said that a general amnesty has been announced by the Taliban leader, Sheikh Hibatullah Khunzada, that there will not be revenge attacks or retributions. What we have to now wait and see what sort of government the Taliban want to form, because we have to remember they are in control of 100% of the country except for one or two areas, and the Taliban, do they go and negotiate? Who do they negotiate with? Or do they just basically announce their own government?
And do we have reports of how the Taliban have been establishing their rule in other cities where they have taken control?
Yes, the Taliban in Kandahar, in Herat, in these places have been calling on Afghan traders to come out back to businesses. They're trying to make the cities functional. We do have reports that they have banned women from working in Kandahar at a bank in Herat as well. But as I said, we'll have to wait and hear who is the Taliban government led by, what is their position on these important issues, because this is still very much Taliban trying to transition, from fight into governance. For that, we'll have to wait for them.
And yes, can you tell us more about the reaction from women? Have you been speaking to any women? How are they feeling about this change of power?
I have not been able to speak to women. I have not been able also to leave, my home for areas that are too far in the city of Kabul. And in and around, I've seen some normal signs of life. But there's been gunfire and there's been, helicopters and very heavy noises of, massive planes over the skies of Kabul that have not stopped now for 24 hours.
All right. Well, we hope you can stay safe. Thank you, Bilal Sarwari, reporting live from Kabul. Now, several countries, along with the UN and NATO, have said they won't recognize a government that comes to power through force. But China says it's ready to deepen friendly and cooperative relations with Afghanistan. And while other countries are scrambling to evacuate their diplomatic staff in Kabul, China's embassy there remains operational. Here's a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson speaking earlier Monday.
China's embassy in Afghanistan is still operating normally. The ambassador and the consular staff are fulfilling their duties at their posts. We hope that the Taliban can unite with the different parties and ethnic groups of Afghanistan to build a widely inclusive political framework so as to lay the foundation for enduring peace in Afghanistan.
More on China's reaction to the collapse of the government in neighboring Afghanistan with our correspondent Charles Pellegrin in Beijing.
As far as China is concerned, the Taliban entered Kabul as liberators, and that's what we saw this Monday in the statements made by the spokesperson of the Foreign Affairs Ministry here in Beijing, saying that China respected the will of the Afghan people and hoped to see an end to the war in the country. Another hope is to see the Taliban honor their promise made to the Chinese to establish an open and inclusive Islamic government that can guarantee the safety of the Afghan Afghan people. Now, the Chinese embassy in Kabul has not suspended its operations, and although most of the Chinese citizens in the country have already left. So this support to the Taliban that was obtained back in July 28th during a high-level meeting between the Taliban and Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi in Tianjin, where the Taliban promised not to harbor any groups hostile to China in Afghanistan, including especially Uyghur militants. Afghanistan and the Xinjiang region of China have a very narrow border, and Xinjiang is the region where China is brutally repressing what it qualifies as terrorism and separatism of its Muslim minorities. But when it comes to its foreign policy, China, above all, is a pragmatist, a realist. And when it comes to Afghanistan, the most important thing for Beijing is to guarantee a stable transition of power.
That was our correspondent Charles Péligan reporting from Beijing. Now, for more analysis, we're joined here in the studio by Rob Parsons, France 24's chief editor. Thanks for joining us here in the studio, Rob. Now, just last year, the U.S. and the Taliban signed what was called at the time a landmark agreement in Doha, and under that pact, American forces agreed to withdraw if the Taliban entered into peace talks with the Afghan government. Now, that clearly hasn't happened. What went wrong with these talks?
There are a number of factors, I think, but prime among them is, I think, that the Taliban themselves were never particularly set on achieving their goal, which is control of Afghanistan through the peace talks. The peace talks were a sideshow to what they were doing inside the country, in other words, the insurgency, which was becoming increasingly successful. And the more successful it became, the less was the need, as far as they were concerned, to make concessions to the Afghan government. From the other side, President Ashraf Ghani was regarded as a difficult negotiator. He didn't enjoy the role of negotiating with the Taliban. It was something he entered into reluctantly. He was an irascible negotiator as well. And the relationship between him and the Afghan leadership was always a difficult one. I think those are the two key factors undermining the progress. But the most important, undoubtedly, the fact that for the Taliban, what they were achieving on the ground was much more important than what they were ever likely to achieve in the talks in Doha.
So the Taliban were already having progress on the ground, as you just said. How has this been building up in recent years, the Taliban's progress on the ground in Afghanistan, as you said?
Well, for a while, incrementally, we saw the Taliban taking control of provinces, particularly around in the south, around Helmand. But occasionally, too, they would take provinces where before they had not been particularly successful, like Kunduz, for instance, which they took on 2 occasions in the past, so they were very quickly forced out. They had success along the east of the country, but gradually those successes and the failure of the government to push them out effectively meant that their traction inside the country grew stronger and stronger, to the point where over the last year we've seen what was a sort of an incremental progress turn into the role that we've seen over the last few months, where they simply became unstoppable.
So a lot of people have been pointing recently to the failure of the Afghan military to prevent this lightning offensive from the Taliban. But as you just said, it seems that these failures have been occurring for years now. What are the systemic issues at play here?
Yeah, the failures have been there right from the beginning. And I suppose the big question is, is it really possible, to create in Afghanistan, was it really possible to create in Afghanistan a modern, effective army along the lines of the sort that the United States and others, NATO, had hoped that it would be possible to create in a country where illiteracy, apart from anything else, is massively high? How do you create massive, effective soldiers who need to understand modern technologies, given that sort of raw material? Very, very difficult. Add into the equation corruption on a pretty massive scale, poor leadership at various different levels in the armed forces, but particularly at the very top. I think the Americans and others did manage to create a sort of middle-level officer corps that was quite effective, but higher than that, they failed significantly. Those are the main factors. It's not that there weren't enough men. The Afghan army even until the last few days, was 3 times as strong as the Taliban, over 300,000 men at arms. It wasn't the equipment. They had fantastic equipment, the best equipment you can possibly buy. But the leadership was clearly a problem. And also, it has to be said, lack of morale. People, the Afghan army, like the police force as well, did not really buy into this concept of a modern democratic Afghanistan. They felt that they weren't the beneficiaries of this apparent democracy that they were being told about. When it came to lives in the provinces, there was corruption. Justice was very slowly meted out. Often when it was meted out, it was unjustly carried out. So there was a lot of frustration with the state as well. And if you put all those factors together, you have ultimately what we've just seen over the last few weeks.
And if we look at it from the U.S. side, what went wrong there in terms of policy?
Well, what I've just been saying, I think, probably there was not a great deal that they could have done that would have significantly changed the picture in the long run, unless they had dealt with the overriding problems of corruption. But very difficult to do. You cannot persuade Afghans or force Afghans to change their political structures. In what is, although it's a long time in terms of US policy, 20 years, but in terms of political education, changing the political culture of a country, it's not a very long time at all. So I think one can argue that once they got past the initial stage of the operation, defeating al-Qaeda, that after that, the challenge was simply too great. It was impossible to modernize Afghanistan and turn it into a modern democratic society when the population at large was largely illiterate, not buying into the idea, apart from the intellectuals in the major cities like Kandahar and Kabul, Herat and others. The vast bulk of the population was poor, illiterate, and not buying into it. An almost impossible task for the US.
So the nation-building mission after the initial mission of diminishing al-Qaeda's capacities was flawed.
Absolutely flawed. The question should have been asked at the beginning whether or not it was possible. And I think looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, Congress, when it comes to look at what went wrong in Afghanistan, will consider that as one of the key issues, that how do you nation build unless the nation itself is buying into the concept, and unless all the players, the major players, are buying into the concept and not trying to line their own pockets. Often that was the case. Not always. There were many good people in Afghanistan who were acting in the interests of the country and wanted to democratize the country. But ultimately, the failure lay in what I think is an almost impossible task.
And let's take a look now at the geopolitical ramifications of this Taliban takeover. China has said it's ready to have friendly ties with Afghanistan. Russia says it will consider recognizing the Taliban based on its conduct. Tell us more about that.
Well, Russia has got, like China, but Russia in particular has a long-standing interest in Afghanistan, dating back not just to the 1980s with the long Afghan war, which cost the Soviet Union an awful lot, but right back into the 19th century as well. It is important for Russia. Russia has strong relationships with the Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, which border Afghanistan. The last thing it wants on those borders is instability, which could ultimately lead to instability on Russia's borders with those Central Asian states. So it's very keen to ensure that there is stability as soon as possible in Afghanistan. And if that means dealing with the Taliban, then so be it. That's what they will do. And they will be hoping, they've already been in negotiations with Taliban leaders. They will have made it clear, I'm sure, that their main interest is stability and to make sure that the conflict doesn't spread across the borders, that for instance, drug smuggling, which is something that the Taliban have been very active in with opium and heroin in its own funding operations over the last couple of decades, is kept to an absolute minimum, does not cross the border into Central Asia and into Russia. From the point of view of China, they also are very keen to keep things under control. China has a small but porous border with Afghanistan. It's about 74 kilometers long, rugged mountain terrain. But the Chinese are concerned that there may be an export of the Taliban ideology into China, into the Uyghur areas. The Chinese have a lot of concerns about the spread of jihadism in Xinjiang province. They are clearly trying to put the lid on any possible spread of what's been happening in Afghanistan into China. They're saying they're happy to talk to the Afghan leadership. For its part, the Afghan leadership has said to the Chinese, look, we're happy to have a good relationship with you. They're thinking further down the road, the country economically is in a terrible position at the moment. They need Chinese economic investment, Chinese economic support. The last thing they want to do at the moment is antagonize the Chinese.
Yes, and so we've just pulled up this map so our viewers can see better here, the small border Afghanistan shares with China and the Central Asian countries. And
you see the tiny border here that Afghanistan has with China.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that analysis, Rob Parsons, France 24's chief foreign editor. And that wraps up this special here on France 24 of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. But do stay tuned. We have more world news coming up for you shortly.